The house where Montgomery Clift once lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, has long been a place of fascination and fear for those who've dared to enter. It's not just the memories of the actor's past that linger here, but something more unsettling, something that seems to hold the space in a way that cannot be explained. In the quiet hours of the night, when the wind rustles the leaves outside, the house feels unnervingly alive. People who have visited the place speak of a peculiar stillness that hangs in the air, broken only by sounds that don't belong. Footsteps echo through the empty halls, but when you check, there's no one there. Whispers seem to rise from nowhere, low murmurs that almost sound like fragments of a conversation from the past. The most unsettling occurrence, though, is the presence of Clift himself, or what some believe is his spirit. Over the years, numerous people have reported catching a fleeting glimpse of a man in the windows, his face partially obscured by shadows, but unmistakably familiar. Those who have dared to step inside during the night often speak of the same phenomenon. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, appearing in the corners of the rooms, standing motionless as if lost in thought. His eyes, though distant, are strangely intense, as if he's aware of their presence. One night, a group of friends, curious about the stories surrounding the house, decided to stay the night. They had heard the rumors, of course, but dismissed them as nothing more than local legend. But as the night wore on, they began to question their disbelief. Around 2 a.m., they heard the faint sound of piano keys. It was a low, melancholic tune, one that seemed oddly familiar, like a song half remembered. They followed the sound, only to find the piano in the study empty, untouched. Suddenly, the air grew colder. A figure appeared in the doorway, its shape vaguely human but somehow distorted, as if caught between worlds. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, leaving only the eerie silence behind. The house seemed to shift after that. The temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes unbearable heat, other times a sharp, bone-chilling cold. There were moments when the sound of breathing could be heard in the dark corners of rooms, soft and shallow, like someone was waiting for something or someone. But the most unnerving thing of all was the voice. Soft at first, then louder, it began to hum a tune, a song that seemed both haunting and ancient, as if it had been trapped in the walls of the house for decades. The melody was familiar, too. Many claimed it was the very song Clift had once sung in his most famous films, but with a sorrowful, almost mournful twist. People who lived in the house after Clift's death have reported similar experiences. Some left, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them, following them through the rooms. Others refused to stay past dusk, too frightened by the unnatural chill and the sensation that they weren't alone. It's as if Clift's spirit, tied to the place where he spent his final years, refuses to move on. For those who are brave enough to step inside, the house in St. Petersburg remains a mystery, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead seems almost non-existent. No one knows for sure if it's truly Montgomery Clift's ghost that haunts the rooms, or if something else is at play, but one thing is certain. The house, in all its eerie quiet, holds a presence that cannot be ignored. As the days passed, rumors about the house continued to spread. Some locals began to speculate that the house was more than just a haunted relic of Montgomery Clift's past. It was as if something darker had taken root within its walls, something that wasn't content to merely haunt. Visitors began experiencing odd sensations, like being watched, even when no one was around. It was as if the house itself was alive, responding to the very presence of the living. One evening, a paranormal investigator, drawn by the stories, decided to explore the house. Armed with the latest equipment, infrared cameras, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recorders, and motion sensors, he set up his gear in the dimly lit hallway where the most strange occurrences had been reported. It was said that Clift often wandered the halls, his footsteps echoing when no one was around. As the night deepened, he began to feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, an invisible force that made every step feel heavy. At around 3 a.m., just as he was about to call it a night, The motion sensors in the living room picked up something. First, there was nothing. But then, a figure shifting, half-formed moved through the camera's view. The investigator's breath caught in his throat. The figure was unmistakably human, but it was blurry, its edges distorted like smoke. He zoomed in, his heart racing as the figure grew clearer. It wasn't just anyone. It was Montgomery Clift, standing in the corner of the room, his face expressionless. He raised the camera to record, but before he could capture a single frame, the figure vanished. The temperature dropped suddenly, the chill sinking deep into his bones. And then, the voice came again, the same haunting melody, but now clearer, more urgent. It seemed to come from the floorboards beneath him, as if it were emanating from the house itself. A shiver ran down his spine. "Monty," he whispered, his voice trembling, "are you still here?" The air grew thick, and the investigator felt something brush past him. He spun around, but the hallway was empty, the silence deafening. He dared not move, fearing what might come next. Suddenly, the air shifted once more, and he felt as though he were no longer alone in the room. It was then that he saw it, just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow moving across the walls, but it was enough. There, in the dim light, was a figure standing by the window. Tall and gaunt, it resembled Montgomery Clift, but there was something wrong about it. The eyes, those cold, hollow eyes, stared back at him, unblinking, as if piercing through him, seeing more than he was willing to show. A strange sensation washed over him. He felt as if he were being pulled into those eyes, as if the figure was drawing him in, compelling him to step closer. But before he could react, the figure vanished, fading into the shadows with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. The air grew still once more, and the temperature returned to normal. The investigator stood frozen, unsure whether what he'd witnessed was a trick of the mind or something far more sinister. He left the house that night, but he would never forget the feeling of being drawn into the figure's gaze, of being caught between worlds. The EVP recorder, when reviewed, revealed something disturbing. A voice, deep and sorrowful, murmuring words that weren't from this time. The words weren't in English, but the investigator was sure they were a plea, some kind of desperate cry for help. As word of this encounter spread, more people came to the house, eager to witness its paranormal activity firsthand. Some left in terror, unable to explain the strange sensations they'd felt, the voices they'd heard. Others grew obsessed with the house, convinced that the spirit of Montgomery Clift still roamed its halls, trapped in a cycle of torment, trying to reach someone, anyone. But the most chilling discovery came when a local historian began researching the property's past. Hidden in the house's old records was a startling revelation. The land itself had been home to several tragedies long before Montgomery Clift ever stepped foot inside. There had been multiple deaths, strange deaths dating back to the early 20th century. All of them seemed to be connected to the house in some way, as if the very ground beneath it had been soaked in sorrow. One of the deaths was particularly disturbing. A woman, a local resident, had mysteriously vanished after being seen in the house, her body never found. Some believe she, too, became a part of the house's twisted history, her restless spirit joining Clift's. And yet, for all the strange events surrounding the house, no one could ever prove who or what was behind them. Some began to believe that Montgomery Clift's spirit had somehow become entangled with the house, but others feared something darker, something older, was at play. The house, it seemed, had its own desires, its own secrets, waiting for the next person to step inside, to become part of its story. The question remained: was Montgomery Clift simply a victim of the house, or had something else, something far more ancient, claimed him, turning him into yet another lost soul, wandering the halls in search of an escape? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As the weeks passed, the legend of the Montgomery Clift house continued to grow. The once quiet neighborhood in St. Petersburg had become a hub for thrill-seekers, skeptics, and paranormal enthusiasts alike. But it wasn't just the haunted reputation that drew people in, it was the unease that seemed to cling to the property, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. The house had begun to take on a life of its own in ways that no one could explain. Doors would open and close on their own, and lights would flicker in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be a malfunction. The air was thick with a palpable tension, as if something or someone was keeping a constant vigil over the house. But it was the garden that intrigued visitors the most. Overgrown with vines and creeping ivy, the garden had become a place of whispered stories and strange occurrences. Some swore they had seen a figure standing near the wrought iron fence late at night, a man dressed in dark clothing, looking out across the yard as if searching for something or someone. When they approached, the figure would disappear, leaving only the scent of roses and a lingering chill in the air. One evening, a young couple visiting the area decided to take a late-night walk through the garden. They had heard the stories, of course, but like many others, they thought them to be nothing more than local lore. As they wandered along the overgrown paths, the sounds of the city faded, and a strange, oppressive silence settled in around them. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden's forgotten corners. As they reached the far end of the garden, the air grew heavier, as if a storm were about to break. The wind shifted suddenly, and they heard it a soft, melancholic tune, barely audible at first, like a distant melody carried on the breeze. The woman, feeling uneasy, reached for her boyfriend's arm. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, though he couldn't explain why the sound made his heart race. They walked closer, trying to make sense of the strange noise. The closer they got to the center of the garden, the clearer the music became. It was a piano, playing a slow, haunting melody, a tune that seemed familiar but impossible to place. The woman froze in place, her gaze fixed on a figure standing in the center of the garden, near the overgrown fountain. It was him, the man Montgomery Clift, but it wasn't a living, breathing person. The figure was transparent, ghostly, like a fading memory. His form flickered in and out of existence, his eyes distant and lost, as if trapped in a moment from the past. He stood still, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on something beyond their reach, as if waiting for someone or something to return. The couple stood rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. The air felt thick, as if the garden itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The woman's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, trying to capture the scene. But as she raised the device, the figure of Clift seemed to notice her. His head turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, she felt as though he could see straight through her. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. The music stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. The garden, which moments before had felt alive with energy, was now silent and empty. The couple stood in stunned silence, too afraid to speak, unsure of what they had just witnessed. As they stumbled back toward the front gate, they passed a small, weathered plaque near the entrance of the garden, one that had gone unnoticed until now. The plaque, barely legible, bore a single inscription: "For those who wander, may they never find peace." The words sent a chill down their spines, as if the house itself was warning them away, as if it had claimed them in some way like so many before them. But it wasn't just the visitors who felt the oppressive weight of the house. One night, a renowned medium, known for her ability to communicate with spirits, arrived at the house to perform a séance. She had heard the stories of Clift's restless spirit and was determined to make contact with him, to help him find peace. But when she entered the house, she felt an immediate, almost suffocating force, a presence that seemed to press in from all sides. As she began the ritual, she could sense a darkness lingering in the shadows of the room. The air grew thick, heavy with the energy of something ancient, something that had been waiting. She spoke aloud, calling to the spirit of Montgomery Clift, asking him to reveal himself, to make his presence known. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Then, suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. In the pitch blackness, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway. The medium's heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, sensing the presence drawing closer. She tried to speak, but no words came. The air felt suffocating, like something was wrapping around her, holding her in place. And then, through the darkness, a voice low, distorted whispered her name. It wasn't Clift's voice. It was something older, deeper, its tone filled with malice. The medium froze. The voice wasn't asking for help. It wasn't even pleading. It was a command, an undeniable presence that demanded attention, demanding that she understand what had been hidden for so long. She barely had time to react before everything fell into chaos. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls closing in, the shadows lengthening, reaching out for her. Desperate to escape, she grabbed her equipment and fled the house, vowing never to return. But the house wasn't finished yet. The whispers continued, the footsteps grew louder, and the presence, whatever it was, waited, patient and unyielding, for the next person to enter, to cross the threshold of Montgomery Clift's haunted domain. And somewhere, deep within the walls, the ancient song played on, looping endlessly in the dark. Weeks passed, and the house on St. Petersburg's quiet street seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing day. Its eerie reputation spread far beyond the local community, and still people came. They arrived in search of answers, of closure, but left with nothing but fear and unanswered questions. Some even returned, drawn back by the house's inexplicable pull, only to vanish without a trace. One night, a determined journalist, captivated by the legend of Montgomery Clift's spirit, decided to uncover the truth once and for all. Armed with nothing but a notebook and a recording device, he entered the house, certain that he could separate fact from fiction. He had heard the story's whispers of footsteps, sightings of Clift's ghost, and strange, unexplainable phenomena, but he wasn't a believer. Not yet. As he stepped into the darkened foyer, a chill seemed to fill the air, creeping into his skin. He shook off the feeling, determined to press forward. He had come to document, to prove there was nothing more to the house than old rumors and a long-dead actor's tragic legacy. But the deeper he ventured into the house, the more unsettled he became. The silence was thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The lights flickered as he passed from room to room, and the strange feeling that someone or something was watching him never left. He set up his recorder in the living room and sat down to gather his thoughts, reviewing the notes he had taken. Suddenly, there it was, the unmistakable sound of piano keys. Slow, deliberate, it was the same haunting melody, the one that had followed everyone else. But this time it wasn't faint. It was loud, as though the piano was in the room with him. He froze, his pulse quickening. The sound was coming from upstairs. He stood up slowly, cautiously, and made his way up the creaking staircase, each step echoing in the heavy silence. His breath quickened as he reached the top, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. The piano, he knew, was not supposed to be there. As he walked down the hall, the door to the study creaked open by itself. The music grew louder, as though urging him forward. He stepped inside, and there at the grand piano sat a figure, a man dressed in dark clothing, his back turned, fingers moving gracefully over the keys. The journalist's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't see the man's face, but the shape, the way he moved, was unmistakable. Montgomery Clift. His ghost had returned, just as the stories had said. But something was wrong. His presence felt different, darker, like it wasn't just the spirit of an actor, but something far older, something far more dangerous. The journalist's voice trembled as he called out, "Mr. Clift? Are you here?" The figure stopped playing. Slowly it turned around. The journalist's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was not Clift's, not entirely. His features were twisted, like a shadow of the actor, stretched and contorted. The eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked onto his, staring through him. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow echo. The room seemed to pulse with a low, throbbing hum, as if the house itself was alive, reacting to the presence of the spirit. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping so sharply that the journalist could see his breath fogging in front of him. "I had to," the journalist managed to say, his voice barely audible. "I needed to know what happened." The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, it seemed almost thoughtful. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, it stood up from the piano, its long fingers still twitching, as if trying to play an invisible melody. "The house has a story to tell," the figure said, its voice a low rasp. "And I am its prisoner. We all are." The journalist's mind raced. What did it mean? A prisoner? Was Clift's spirit truly trapped here? Or was something else the force that had claimed the house holding him in its grip, preventing him from moving on? The figure took a step forward, its eyes never leaving the journalist's face. He could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it was searching him, digging into his very soul. "You've heard the song," the figure continued, its voice colder now. "But you don't understand it. You don't understand what you're dealing with." The journalist stepped back, panic rising in his chest. He reached for his recorder, desperate to capture this moment, this truth, but before he could press the button, the figure lunged at him. The room spun, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The air thickened until it was suffocating, and he was overwhelmed by an overwhelming sense of despair, an unshakable certainty that the house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others. The last thing he heard, before everything went dark, was the distant sound of piano keys playing once more. The same melancholy melody, echoing through the house, looping endlessly, as though it would never stop. The next morning, a search party arrived at the house. The journalist's notes, his recorder, and his belongings were found, scattered across the living room. But there was no sign of him, no trace. It was as if he had vanished without a single trace. And so, the house stood, silent as ever, holding its secrets, its tragedies, and its restless souls within its crumbling walls. Those who dared to visit never stayed long, always leaving with more questions than answers. For those who lingered too long, for those who tried to uncover the truth, there was only one constant: the music, that haunting, familiar melody, echoing through the dark, endless night, played on, and the house waited, patient and unyielding, for the next person to enter its grasp. The story of Montgomery Clift's house would never be finished because, in the end, it wasn't just the ghosts that haunted it. It was the house itself, a twisted entity that would never let go, forever trapping those who sought the truth. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.